Everyone, I'm Professor Plank. I respond to various theological and ideological questions and claims from a rationalistic and naturalistic approach in an effort to give and explain the opposite viewpoint and help to balance the conversation. Well, good afternoon, everybody, to this Sunday, October the 20th. Making it less than 2 weeks away from Halloween, one of my favorite holidays of the year. I've got my house all spooky, decked out and decorated, and as well as my workplace. I wanted to get one of those 13-foot tall Jack Skellington decorations for the office, and I tried to pitch it to the head of the office that if we shelled out the money for it, it would be dual purpose, because not only would it be a great decoration for Halloween, but it also comes with the Santa outfit from Nightmare Before Christmas, so that we could put the Santa outfit on him and we could use him again come Christmas time. Unfortunately, my idea was shot down, but we soldier on anyway. So happy Halloween to everyone out there, because this probably, it'll be after Halloween before we do another live stream, since I do them every 2 weeks. But welcome in, everybody. Thanks for being here today. Thanks for hanging out with me. We're going to be doing several things today, as we always do on these live streams. Most notably, we're going to be taking a look at all of the trailers for the God's Not Dead movies. There are now, unfortunately, 5 of them that have been released, so we're going to take a look at those. Can't watch the entirety of them. There's copyright, and obviously we'd be here all day, and I can't handle that much God's Not Dead to try to do a watch along with all of them. But we're going to watch the trailers and react to those today. Of course, we've got some news stories about things going on in the world of religion over the last few weeks, some questions from the audience and from previous live streams, and of course, anybody who sends in any super chats will get priority. I'll read those and answer those questions as well. So, a lot of fun stuff that we're going to be tackling today. So, let's not dilly-dally too much, and let's dive into the first of those things, which is the God's Not Dead trailer reactions. So, I have seen the first God's Not Dead in its entirety, and I've seen bits and pieces of the second one. I have not seen any of 3, 4, or 5, but we'll go ahead and start off with the one that started off the entire craze, the first God's Not Dead. So let's dive right into that trailer. And I'm going to be stopping these throughout them anytime I have something I want to say, so we're not going to be having to deal with the entirety of the trailers without any commentary. But let's dive into God's Not Dead 1.
You prayed and believed your whole life, and here you are. Explain that to me.
Oh, Dean Cain. Superman, why are you doing this? I grew up in the 90s, so of course, being a major comic book fan that I am, I watched the crap out of Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, and so it's a bit sad to see how far Superman has fallen. And of course, I also watched a lot of Hercules, The Legendary Journeys back around the same time as well, so both Hercules and Superman just debasing themselves into this kind of Christian propaganda flotsam nonsense is a bitter pill to swallow, but, you know, they can't all stay, your heroes can't all stay high in your eyes. There's always ones that are going to fall to stuff like this. But you would think that when it comes to celebrities of a high enough status that they wouldn't need to do these kind of movies for the work. And clearly, Kevin Sorbo and Superman here, they don't need it, but they're doing it because they believe in it. So that makes it even kind of sadder.
What do you say to people that are offended by your show because you pray to Jesus in every episode?
If we disown him, he'll disown us.
When a 12-year-old watches his mother dying of cancer, a God who would allow that is not worth believing in. Life is really a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury and signifying nothing.
Name? Wheaton. Josh Wheaton.
So here we see our protagonist of the film.
You might want to think about a different instructor. Come on, man.
So I recognized this guy right off the bat when I was watching this movie because I remember him from the Disney Channel show Good Luck Charlie. I was never a big Disney Channel fan, but there was one show that I did enjoy, and it was Good Luck Charlie. And he was in it. He was the boyfriend of Teddy, kind of the main character of the show. One of the reasons I liked Good Luck Charlie was because of the guy who played the dad in that show. His name's Eric Allen Kramer, and I instantly recognized him when I first saw that show because Eric Allen Kramer has a long history of a lot of good roles, and in fact, for those who did not know this, the dad in Good Luck Charlie was the first actor to ever play a live-action Thor from Marvel Comics Thor. This is way back during the Incredible Hulk TV show with Lou Ferrigno. There was a TV movie. There were a few TV movies for it. One was called The Return of the Incredible Hulk, and it featured Thor. And Eric Allen Kramer, the dad from Good Luck Charlie, was Thor in that movie. So he was the first actor to ever play a live-action Thor. So I liked that show, Good Luck Charlie, and I recognized this guy from that show. And I give him a pass. I give actors like him a pass for being in stuff like God's Not Dead because obviously, young actor trying to get a career off the ground. I'm not sure if he truly, really believes in the message of God's Not Dead or if he just kind of needed the money. Maybe he does. Maybe he is a diehard Christian. I'm not sure, but I'll at least give the young up-and-coming actors a pass when they do stuff like this.
It can't be that bad. Think Roman Colosseum, people cheering for your death.
I'm Professor Radisson. This is Philosophy 150. I would like to bypass senseless debate altogether and jump to the conclusion, which every sophomore is already aware of: there is no God. All that I require from each of you is that you fill in the papers I've just given you with 3 little words: God is dead.
So, yeah, this is one of the things about this movie that irritate me the most. I have a special hatred in my heart for this particular movie in the series because I am a professor. I work in academia. This would be an absolute no-go. What this guy just did, even in a philosophy class, insisting that all the students fill out a form indicating or stating directly that God is dead and signing their names to it. Obviously, it's not binding. I mean, it doesn't really mean anything. But even so, this is a clear violation of freedom of religion. Students do not leave behind their civil rights at the classroom door. They have the exact same First Amendment rights and protections that everyone else does, and that includes the freedom of religion. Even in a philosophy class, even in a comparative religion class where religion is literally the subject matter, you cannot do this. This would invite a lawsuit so fast. Not just on the part of the main character who, throughout the course of the movie, is forced to have a series of debates with the teacher. He obviously would have a lawsuit that he could file, but literally every student in this class could take part in a class action lawsuit against this professor and against the school itself, because you cannot do that. You cannot make your students sign a form to attest to the non-existence of God. Even if this professor had tenure, the first time he did this, the first complaint that would be made against him, he would be fired. Because even with tenure, you cannot violate your students' civil rights. This is ridiculous. This very idea behind this movie is utter nonsense that would never take place in academia. And but this is what the Christian right pushes as happening all over the country, happening in every major university, that atheist professors are just imposing atheism on their students and forcing them to be atheists with their position of power. And if you don't attest to being an atheist, you'll get an F in the class, or you'll get kicked out of the course, or you'll be discriminated against in class. Literally none of that is legal, and none of that stuff even in terms of kind of going on under the radar. Because, there's what the law says, and then there's what actually happens, and it's not always the same thing, right? But no, even in terms of under the radar, this stuff doesn't happen. I just recently finished my annual employee training as a professor, and a big part of that was respecting the rights, the civil rights of your students. And this is not a part of the law that we had to do. This was a thing that my school, that my university does, that they require of all of their instructors. And part of that was religious freedom and respecting the religious freedom of your students. So, yeah, I have a special hatred in my heart for this movie because of the blatant lie of the idea that, hey, professors are just imposing atheism on their students all over the place. It does not happen, especially not like it does in this movie, where they are clearly being discriminated against by a prejudiced professor.
Mr. Wheaton, is something wrong?
I can't do what you want. I'm a Christian.
If you cannot bring yourself to admit that God is dead, then you will need to defend the antithesis.
Think of Jesus as my friend.
You think Jesus is God?
I don't want to disappoint him. So your acceptance of this challenge may be the only meaningful exposure to God and Jesus they'll ever have. See, to me, he's not dead. I don't want anyone to get talked out of believing in him just because his professor thinks they should.
Mr. Wheaton, are you ready?
We're going to put God on trial.
Do you think you're smarter than me, Wheaton? Do not.
And that grabbing him and spitting him around, that could be considered assault, so he'd have a further lawsuit on his hands.
Try to humiliate me in front of my students. In that classroom, there is a God. I'm him.
This experiment is over. You get to decide who the most important person in your life is. Me, Professor Radisson.
But I have to do this thing. Like it's something that God wants me to do. I can't just turn away from it.
You just want to ensnare them in your primitive superstition.
What I want is for them to make their own choice. That's what God wants.
You have no idea how much I'm going to enjoy failing you.
Yeah, but who are you really looking to fail? Me or God?
God's not dead, he's surely alive. He's living on the inside, roaring like a lion. God's not dead, he's surely alive. He's living on the inside, roaring like...
Did they really deserve to be put in the credits here? The guy from Duck Dynasty is literally only in this movie for a cameo, and they plaster his name in the trailer. So I guess anybody who's noteworthy, who's a big enough name, they wanted all the publicity they could get.
Science supports his existence. You know the truth. So why do you hate him? It's a very simple question. Why do you hate God?
God's not dead, he's surely alive. He's living on the inside, roaring like a lion.
Okay, so there was the trailer for the first God's Not Dead. And throughout the course of the debates that Kevin Sorbo has with the student, it becomes apparent that that he has no non-emotion based arguments against the idea of God. So it becomes clear that he really does believe in God. Like, he's not even an atheist. And in that tense moment where they're kind of shouting back and forth at each other in their final debate, he gets the professor to finally yell, "Because I hate God, he took everything from me." So it's like, clearly he's not even an atheist. He just is anti-religion. He just hates God. So he very clearly does still believe in him. And that is obviously apparent throughout the course of their debates, because he pretty much never offers anything close to a real secular argument. He never offers any kind of argument in terms of, well, the idea of God doesn't make sense, the idea of a disembodied mind that's not housed in like a physical brain. There's no evidence that that's even possible. Anything like that. It's just, I hate God, I hate God, I hate God. And so bad arguments all around from somebody who was not even really an atheist, just an anti-Christian, and so much obvious anti-Christian discrimination. There's no way he would be employed. There's no way that university would still be open, because it would have been sued into oblivion by that point. So all complete nonsense from that movie. And luckily, the entire God's Not Dead series did not revolve around academia. They did move on from academia, but that didn't happen until the third movie, because the second movie still dealt with education. So let's jump over to God's Not Dead 2 and the trailer for it.
In this day and age, people seem to forget that the most basic human right of all is the right to believe.
No prayers, no moments of silence, nothing.
Think of the other children out there who are subjected to their repressive belief system.
If we sit by and do nothing, the pressure that we're feeling today will mean persecution tomorrow. We're at war.
What makes nonviolence so radical is its unwavering commitment to a nonviolent approach.
Isn't that sort of like what Jesus meant when he said that we should love our enemies?
Now this one hurt. God's Not Dead 2 did actually hurt because of Melissa Joan Hart here. Now, I am at present asexual aromantic, but I didn't come to that realization about myself until adulthood. In my teenage years, I was still prone to the occasional celebrity crush, and my very first celebrity crush was from a little show on Nickelodeon called Clarissa Explains It All, starring this lady here, Melissa Joan Hart. And that crush didn't go away when she then went on to be Sabrina the Teenage Witch. So I have a lot of nostalgic good feelings about Melissa Joan Hart. And then she went and she starred in God's Not Dead 2. Not so much a problem of her espousing Christian beliefs and ideology. That's fine. But again, we have here another example of a movie that craps on the education system and blatantly lies about it. So in this case, we're not in college anymore, we're back in high school, and in this case, she's a teacher who is not teaching anything at all about religion. She's teaching about history, and a student, as we just saw there, asks that, oh, this message of nonviolence, isn't that the same as Jesus's message? And here we see her reply to that.
Yes, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
One of your students.
And for that, she gets in trouble. Like her job is in jeopardy. They say, hey, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to talk about Jesus. This is a school. There's supposed to be separation of church and state. And it's so ridiculously overblown because, for one, she did not bring up Jesus. The student brought up Jesus. And there's no rule that says if a student asks you a question in a history class about Jesus, or from a historical perspective, or even from a perspective of the teachings of Jesus as compared to the teachings of someone like Gandhi, that you have to just clam up and change the subject. Like, that's not a rule. That's not a law. You don't have to do that. You can certainly answer the question, and in a history class, you can talk about Jesus from a historical perspective as a faith leader, as somebody who espoused different teachings that people still follow today. So the idea that a teacher will get in trouble for literally that, it's not like that scene goes on beyond what we just saw here in the trailer and she starts like holding sermons in class or anything. That was literally it. That was literally all she said in regards to Jesus, answering her student's question, and all of a sudden it becomes this big overblown thing where her job is in jeopardy. That would literally never happen.
Students sent a text to their parents. Did this happen?
If you're asking whether I responded to a student's question, yes.
And your answer incorporated the words of Jesus.
What were you thinking, Grace?
The Tholies are asking that you be fired, plus revocation of your teaching certificate.
How do we make this go away and not get blood on our hands? We let the ACLU do it.
We're going to prove once and for all that God is dead.
The ACLU would not be prosecuting her. If anything, they would be defending her. the ACLU stands up for civil liberties, and that includes religious liberties. Now, yes, if there are teachers who are openly proselytizing in a public school, or who are trying to get the students to go to church and become Christian, convert to Christianity, believe in God, yes, they will file a lawsuit on behalf of the students who are not Christian and don't particularly want a Christian message thrown at them like that. But they also defend people who are clearly acting within their own religious liberty. If they're not proselytizing, if they're not pushing religion, but just free exercise or expression of their own religion, ACLU will back you up on that. The ACLU would never prosecute her for what happened in that classroom. It's utterly ridiculous. And another sad fall from grace is this man on screen here. This is Ray Wise, who ends up being a character who comes back in later God's Not Dead movies. And it's very sad to see what has become of him, because of probably everybody in all of the 5 God's Not Dead movies, this guy is probably the most successful and longest running actor with a list of acting credits as long as your arm. Like, he has been in tons of stuff, and tons of like big, great stuff too. He was in the original RoboCop. If anybody remembers the group of thugs, the bad guys, he was one of them. He was like the second in command. He was Clarence Bodiger's second in command. He was the guy who tried to kick RoboCop in the balls and broke his foot in doing so. He was also in the first Swamp Thing movie. He was Swamp Thing. He was Alec Holland before he became Swamp Thing. He's been in tons of movies and tons of shows and comedies and sci-fi and horror. He was in Jeepers Creepers 2. He was the farmer who made the big pneumatic harpoon gun and shot the creeper with it several times over. He was kind of a badass in that movie. He's been in tons of stuff, and now he's been in multiple God's Not Dead movies as this cartoonish caricature of an atheist activist who sits there and almost like he should have a handlebar mustache that he's twirling while he says, "We're going to prove once and for all that God is dead." And it's like, it's so cartoonish and over the top and ridiculous, and so sad to see a prolific actor like Ray Wise fall to this level.
No order in the matter of Thorley versus Wesley.
Oh, and that judge, that was Ernie Hudson from Ghostbusters, wasn't it? I didn't realize that before.
Mr. Kane will insist faith isn't on trial here. But that is exactly what is on trial.
You're looking to prove that Jesus Christ existed? Oh, that's ridiculous. I hate what people like your clients stand for and what they're doing to our society.
You're under arrest.
These people, they're looking to destroy you.
Everyone's telling me to stay out of it. What is your heart telling you to do?
I would rather stand with God and be judged by the world than stand with the world and be judged by God. I am not going to be afraid to say the name Jesus.
Is this the exact same footage of the Newsboys from the first trailer? Like, they couldn't even do a second take of this in different outfits or anything?
If we're going to insist that a Christian's right to believe is subordinate to all other rights, then it's not a right.
Mr. Inland, you are out of order. I charge you with contempt.
I accept the charge because I have nothing but contempt for these proceedings.
God's not dead, he's surely alive. He's living on the inside, roaring like a lion. God's not dead, he's surely.
All right, there's God's Not Dead 2, and thankfully their last real foray into academia, and also the last of the God's Not Dead series that actually had real celebrities in it. I mean, beyond Ray Wise popping up in future installments. But after this one, the next 3 movies then become centered on a guy we saw in both of those trailers, David A.R. White, who is I believe the only character who is in all 5 movies and becomes the central figure of the next 3 films. So let's jump right over to God's Not Dead 3. I believe this one's called A Light in Darkness.
Sometimes all it takes is a spark. The spark becomes a flame. And if that flame spreads, it transforms everything around it.
All these years, this church has been here. Now it's the crime scene.
What's gonna happen when I find him?
Put him away, I hope, for a long time.
The church has brought nothing but controversy to the school for years.
What's the church doing on a state campus in the first place?
This was my father's church, and it's not for sale.
How do we actually know that our values are any more valid than anyone else's?
God called me to fight.
God calls you, you call me.
His brother is a lawyer. Are you kidding me?
What you're doing, it's against the law.
We're wasting our time.
So yeah, this is the first one that I have not seen any of. I haven't seen any of 3, 4, or 5. But as I understand it, this is all about a court battle to save a burnt-out church. So this one is kind of taking the idea that was in a lot of movies in the 80s where, you know, they were trying to save the rec center from the evil developer who was wanting to buy it up and turn it into a strip mall or something like that. And they're putting it in the form of a church. Well, for one thing, the church is a burned out husk, and I don't believe the main character, David A.R. White, has the funds to rebuild it. So it's kind of a weird argument in the first place. It's like, no, I'm not going to sell the church, but are you going to just leave it in ruins? You're not going to build it back up? And I also think I read the synopsis of it that in the end, he doesn't even keep the church. I mean, obviously he doesn't because he goes on to, in the next couple movies, get into politics and stuff. So he's not still teaching or still preaching at this church. But yeah, it's just, this movie's all about trying to save a church that's burnt rubble.
We cannot respond to hate with more hate.
Is it true?
I just don't see God's mercy here. Especially not from Pastor Dave.
He's human, Keaton.
He's supposed to be a man of God.
What am I doing wrong? You don't get to play innocent.
You did this! The whole world knows what the church is against, but it's getting harder and harder to know what it's for.
Seems like you're the one much is being asked of this time.
My God's not dead, he's surely alive.
It's okay to be broken, Dave. It means God's still shaping you.
As painful and confusing as all of this is, it just might be exactly where God wants you right now. Without grace is our goal, or just fighting.
How do you define truth exactly?
I believe truth is a person.
Don't forget, we are called to be a light.
Oh, I think I just saw the guy, Jefferson from Married with Children. The neighbor, Al's neighbor, was in there. Oh, that's sad that he's fallen to this.
In the darkness.
Sometimes all it takes is a spark.
Let love explode and bring the dead to life.
Okay, so this clearly has been the worst of the trailers thus far. With the other two, it was pretty understandable what exactly was going on. In the first one, it was obvious that there was a battle between this teacher, atheist teacher, who wanted all of his students to be atheists, and this student who refused to give up his faith. And there was debates between them. It was very clear that's what was going on. Even if you had never seen God's Not Dead and knew nothing about it, watching that first trailer, you would understand what the plot of that movie was. Same with the second one. Even if you knew nothing about God's Not Dead 2, watching that trailer, you would understand we have a teacher who's getting in trouble because they talked about Jesus in class, and they're going to court for it, battling the ACLU. You knew that's what it was. If you knew nothing about God's Not Dead 3, never seen anything about it before, and you watch this trailer, would you have any idea what's really going on there? Obviously, there was a church that caught on fire, and then there's just a lot of scenes of people yelling at each other and shoving each other, and there's some kind of a court battle, but it's never really explained in the trailer what that's for. It's really tough to parse out exactly what's going on in terms of the plot of this movie. It just seems like there's some goodly Christian people, and there's people who aren't Christian yelling at them and mad at them. Like, it's really tough to explain what the exact plot of this God's Not Dead movie is purely from this trailer. So seems like a big step down from at least the polished nature of the trailer of the previous two. I wonder if they get any better from here, or if we're just going to get worse from here. So let's check out God's Not Dead 4. I believe this is God's Not Dead, We the People.
Freedom is a fragile thing, and it's never more than one generation away from extinction. And those in world history who have known freedom and then lost it have never known it again.
Let's face it, your God, your book, they're in the way. You feel that you're making a last-ditch stand for your faith, and you've chosen this as a hill that you're willing to die on. Our whole faith started because one man chose a hill he was willing to die on.
I would like to call this hearing of the House Subcommittee to order.
Right now, there's an effort on the way to mandate universal educational guidelines.
Once we decide what a child needs to know, it becomes imperative that every child know it.
Remember the visit we got from social services the other day?
I'm here to review your homeschooling environment.
Religion has been removed from our schools. They're teaching kids that they don't need God.
If your children do not show up at school a week from Monday, you will be charged with contempt of court, meaning you will be incarcerated.
Okay, so we're going back to another education story in this one, this time in terms of the homeschooling debate, I guess, and whether or not homeschooling should entail religious instruction and things like that. This one is a lot harder to talk about because every state has its own specific laws regarding homeschooling, and some are going to be more restrictive than others, and it's tough to talk about it in an overall countrywide blanket kind of a sense. But if I was going to, though I'm not an expert on homeschooling laws, I'm fairly certain that there's a lot of latitude given to parents, guardians, in terms of how they go about homeschooling. And there's often very little oversight to it. To the point of, as we just saw, a social worker showed up and said, I'm here to look at your homeschooling environment. Like, that rarely happens. It rarely happens that you're going to have people showing up and actually wanting to do an in-depth look into exactly how you're homeschooling your kids, because they don't have the personnel for that. Social workers do not have enough boots on the ground to be going all around their state checking out all of the homeschooling environments. I mean, that's when you consider all the other stuff social workers have to do in terms of cases where people are literally abusing their children, in terms of people who have just gone through rehab and are trying to get their children back and are now have their children back with them, and the social workers need to go and check in on them to make sure they're not backsliding and they're providing a good environment for their kids. That stuff just tends to be a little more important than checking out the homeschooling curriculum of all the various people throughout the state who are homeschooling their kids, right? You got to check on the safety of the ones who are in literal danger before you go checking on whether or not these homeschooled kids are learning everything they need to learn. And there's not just like hundreds of thousands of social workers in each and every state going all around doing this stuff. So a lot of the times, the only oversight in terms of homeschooling is they'll send you some standardized tests in the mail that they'll want your kids to complete, and then you send them back so that they can check to make sure they have sufficient knowledge over a variety of subjects that they should have knowledge of by that point in their academic career. And that means that, this is like a paper test. And that means that the parents could literally sit there and fill it out themselves with Google open and finding the answers on Google so that they can falsify the test and then claim it was the kids. It's not like the social worker's going to show up and stand over your shoulder while the kids are taking that standardized test. There's very little oversight in a lot of homeschooling, maybe more in some states than others, but the idea that there's going to be this big court case where they're trying to either eliminate homeschooling because of religious reasons, of, these parents are religious and we're afraid that they're teaching religion to their kids. Like, that's ridiculous. I mean, even kids who go to public school, when they go home at the end of the day, their parents can have them do all the Bible studies they want. So the idea that if you're homeschooling your kids, you're not allowed to teach them anything religious, are you insane? Of course a parent can teach religion to their kids. So this is utter nonsense.
Shannon said last night she doesn't want her parents going to jail.
This is bigger than just homeschooling. I think we should fight this. We need to.
Just want to make sure you understand what you're fighting here.
Our district teaches a revisionist version of history.
God is for us. Who can be against us?
Around here, just about everyone else.
The country is just now beginning to realize that unity means winning under our terms.
For 2,000 years, men have been trying to get rid of Christianity. What makes you think that you can accomplish what they couldn't?
They didn't have an 83% approval rating.
Where have I heard this song before? These movies came out over the course of multiple years. Surely they could write like another song that has the same basic message of God's not dead. How about God's Not Dead, the sequel song? Newsboys, come on. You can't have that much else going on in your careers.
That's part of your plan, isn't it? Keep us all divided so we don't realize that you're really chipping away at our freedoms and liberties.
America is a country so blessed to whom much is given, much will be required.
You see those statues and those monuments out there? They say, you work for us.
You are out of order, Mr. Bell.
A government of the people, by the people, for the people.
So David A.R. White, Pastor Dave there, just chewing the scenery in his impassioned speech there at the end. All based on the Christian persecution complex. That's really the main through line of this entire series of films is Christian persecution complex. Started off with Christian persecution complex in universities, which doesn't really happen, and then went on to the Christian persecution complex in public schools, which doesn't really happen, and then Christian persecution complex in terms of real estate holdings when your church burns down, which doesn't really happen because churches tend to be owned by the diocese of the area, and when one of their properties is damaged, they have plenty of money to get it fixed, usually, unless they decide that there's not enough attendance in a church, there's no reason to keep it open, and then they offer it for sale. And for the most part, the pastor who preaches there has no real say in whether or not the church is going to be repaired or sold off. So logistically, the third movie didn't make sense. And now this one, the Christian persecution complex of homeschooling advocates. So, let's then move right along to the fifth one, the final movie. Well, maybe not the final. They could keep this series of films going forever. But the most recent that came out just a couple of months ago, God's Not Dead 5.
If we ever forget that we're one nation under God, then we will be a nation going under.
Wait a minute. Didn't the trailer for God's Not Dead 4 start off with Reagan? Weren't they using clips of Reagan in the last one? Hold on. Going back to God's Not Dead 4.
Freedom is a fragile thing, and it's never more than one generation away from extinction.
Yep, so they're starting off with clips of Reagan from God's Not Dead 4 and God's Not Dead 5. I guess they figure if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So, anyway, back to God's Not Dead 5.
If we ever forget that we're one nation under God, then we will be a nation going under.
Now more than ever, Christians must realize that we are being called to deliver hope to a country that's feeling hopeless. Faith begins where your comfort zone ends. We need to step out into that faith.
We're 6 weeks out from Election Day, and a lot of folks have lost hope in the future of our country.
We must maintain a wall of separation between church and state.
And there's Ray Weiss back to make me sad all over again. Ray Wise, you're better than this.
Religion has no place in the public square.
Once they bankrupt our country, they will have complete control.
Where did we go wrong, Lord?
We need someone who can light a fire in the voters.
The preacher. He helped on those education hearings.
I've been hired to manage a campaign for Congress.
I'm not a politician.
If you don't take on this fight, we could lose everything.
They found someone to run against you.
Are we worried about a preacher?
My next guest is a candidate for Congress. You're going to get a lot of questions about your faith.
Well, maybe people are looking for more spiritual and moral leadership in Washington.
You're making God an easy target for them,
Oh, and Dean Cain's back for this one as well.
Pastor.
God's not the target body. Our country is. God's just standing in their way.
I will not be made a fool of. I won't stop until your moral high ground crumbles beneath your feet.
You don't win unless you play by their rules.
I feel like I have two options. I can either do the things my faith asks me not to, or I lose this race. It's like God keeps putting these impossible mountains in front of me.
Perhaps God put those mountains in front of you to show that they can be moved.
Please pray for David, guys.
In God we trust.
This contest is a...
Hey, same song, but at least they did a different shoot of it this time around.
about shaping the future of our nation.
Keep your boy in mind. Because like his God, I can give it, and I can take it away.
How do you know it's God?
Reverend Hill, your beliefs are a textbook example of Christian nationalism.
Whenever anyone of faith promotes a policy that you don't like, you label them a Christian nationalist.
I have heard that phrase in that snippet before. No, we don't. We label it Christian nationalism when it's Christian nationalism. There are plenty of policies that are put forth by people of faith that I may not like, but it's Christian nationalism when those policies are discriminatory towards people who are not Christian, or discriminatory towards people who are not native-born Americans, discriminatory towards other ethnicities, other nationalities, and particularly when they're pushing Christianity beyond the scope of what the law allows in clear violation of the separation of church and state. That's when it's Christian nationalism. Nobody is complaining or calling it Christian nationalism when you pass a law that affirms your faith, that, that codifies into law people's right to, preach in public areas. That's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with the guy who stands on the street corner and is wanting to hand out Bibles to people who pass by, and laws that allow for that are fine. Nobody calls that Christian nationalism. It's when you are trying to pass laws like, say, there's going to be a Bible in every public school classroom and teachers are going to have to teach out of it or else their job will be at risk. That's Christian nationalism. It's when you are attempting to use the law to enforce your beliefs on people who don't share them. It's when you're trying to use the law to enforce Christianity. That's Christian nationalism. And this attempt to push back against it is like, oh, you just say that everything that you don't like is Christian nationalism. No, it's Christian nationalism when it's Christian nationalism. If you just stop trying to pass laws and put forth bills and do things politically that you are not allowed to do under the religious freedom guaranteed by the First Amendment of the Constitution, you won't get called a Christian nationalist. Maybe just stop trying to use the law to force your religion on other people.
We need to stand up. Send the message to Washington. Tell them you're not ready to give that power up. You have the power to change things. Not me, not him, you.
In God we trust. And without God, democracy will not and cannot long endure.
Both beginning and ending with Reagan. Boy, they loved that guy, didn't they? He probably would not have been on board with a lot of the stuff the Christians are trying to do these days in regards to politics. But hey, he's their boy. They love him to death. All right, so that's God's Not Dead 5. So a lot of the same thing, a lot of the Christian persecution complex. In this case, we had Pastor Dave running for Congress and against the evil Ray Wise and his evil atheistic ways. Just more of this notion that, hey, they just hate us because we're Christian. They're trying to keep us out of politics because we're Christian. It's like, no, we're trying to, if anything, just get you to stop using political power and authority to run roughshod over people who are not Christian. I mean, the idea that Christians trying to get into politics have a hard time of things or that they're getting squeezed out of the political process, until fairly recently, there were, and I think in some places still are, laws on the books that you cannot run for public office if you are an atheist. Like, there are laws that aren't followed anymore. They're not enforced anymore, but I think there are still places where they're literally still in the books that you can't run for public office if you're an atheist. And there was a time, not that long ago, when those kind of laws were actually enforced. And even though they may not be enforced as law anymore, it's still practically impossible to get elected to any public office as an atheist. You can count on one hand the amount of senators or congresspeople who are outspoken non-believers. It's pretty much impossible. So the idea that, oh, we're going to run this pastor and he's going to have a hell of a time getting elected because he's a devoutly religious person and devoutly religious people never get elected to office. Are you out of your freaking mind? The amount of avowed Christians in American politics is vastly out of proportion to the number of Christians in society. The amount of Christians in major political positions is like 98% or so, versus the amount of devout Christians in the general populace being something like 60%. So it's utterly ridiculous how easy Christians have it in American politics. And yet, here we have the Christian persecution complex, again on full display, just like in all the God's Not Dead movies, and just like in all the God's Not Dead movies, it's completely wrong. It's not just overblown, it's utterly false, and if anything, the reverse is true. But Christians are nothing if not insistent that they are the most persecuted and put upon and oppressed and repressed people in the whole of society, which is it would be laughable if it wasn't so stupidly sad. So, those are the trailers for the current 5 God's Not Dead movies, and like I said, seen the first one, seen parts of the second one, having seen the trailers for 3, 4, and 5, I can't imagine having any desire to actually watch them in their entirety, unless I was just going to get like good and drunk one night and wanted a laugh. But I'm not much on drinking and watching Christian propaganda films for a good time. So, that's all I got to say on God's Not Dead. So, let's then turn our attention to the next thing we're going to talk about today. Let's get out of the realm of crazy, ridiculous Christian fiction and turn our attention to some actual real-world news stories, things going on in the world of religion recently. So, of course, we are just over 2 weeks away from the presidential election in the U.S. So obviously that's dominating the news cycle in tons of ways. I mean, practically every story that you can find on the major news outlets is going to turn back to the election and to politics in some way or another. And that's definitely going to remain the case until after Election Day. So the first story concerning religion also has to do, obviously, with the election. Now, normally during campaigns for the presidency, there is a pretty large focus on the religion of the candidates, particularly usually the Republican candidate, as the evangelical right usually makes up a big part of their base. But it tends to be the case for the Democrat candidate as well. They tend to want to try to capture as much of the religious vote as they can, and that's no exception this time around. Harris is going to church, highlighting the absence of religion from the 2024 campaign. So even though Harris is making some stops in churches today, being Sunday and all, it still has been maybe the least religious of the presidential campaigns that anybody can remember. Now, obviously the last campaign, when it was Biden and Trump, Biden is a devout Catholic, and he makes all kinds of stops to churches and faith organizations every time he's been on the campaign trail. Harris has not particularly leaned as heavily into religion as her predecessor. And then as far as Donald Trump goes, Donald Trump is easily the least religious candidate of any political race in my lifetime. And it's so weird that he keeps trying to court the evangelical right vote. I mean, it's not ununderstandable. Obviously, he wants as many votes as he can get, and when it comes to being a Republican, if you don't have the religious vote, you don't got much of anything. But what's weird and hard to wrap your head around is why the evangelicals so like him and consider him such a godly person and such a godly candidate. Like, as a person, he is the most unchristian person. What is the 3-time divorce, multiple cheating, the convictions for fraud, the convictions for bad business practices, being found liable for sexual assault, and just a whole host of clearly immoral things, as well as just, having absolutely no knowledge of religion and Christianity to begin with. When asked what his favorite book of the Bible was, he couldn't even mention one, and he tried to waffle his way out of it. Oh, I like them all. They're all good. All the books of the Bible are good. Like, obviously he's not mentioning one because he doesn't even know what a single book of the Bible is. He's probably never cracked one open in his life. But he's been, over the course of his political career, making various stops at churches. And today, Harris is going to a church as well. So the article goes on to say that Religion is making a rare appearance in the campaign trail this week in a presidential election that's dwelled less on candidates' personal faith than any in recent memory. Vice President Kamala Harris is planning to attend services and speak at the New Birth Missionary Baptist Church outside Atlanta on Sunday, that's today, while her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, will visit Victorious Believers Ministries in Saginaw, Michigan. So, yeah, even though Harris and Walz have not really done much in the way of religion and trying to court the religious vote up till now, with a couple weeks left till the election, they're making a somewhat attempt at doing so. So, using Sunday to go and talk to some actual religious congregations. Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump on Thursday criticized Harris for skipping the Al Smith dinner in New York City, a high-profile fundraiser for Catholic charities, saying her absence was very disrespectful to our great Catholic community. So, Trump just a few days ago was talking in front of a large group of Catholics. So they are both doing a little bit to court the religious vote, but, comparative to previous elections, it's been very, very light on the religious angle, which I'm very happy to see as a secular person. I don't think that people should be making decisions about their candidates based on their religion or non-religion, but should be focused more on their character and specifically more on their policy proposals and things like that, the things that actually impact how they're going to govern. So, yeah, it's kind of a nice thing to see a less religious campaign than we've seen in recent years. Now, one of the reasons why perhaps the candidates for president are doing less in terms of religious campaigning than they ever have before could have to do with a new election study that has found that people of faith vote less than people not particularly of faith. So, some of the study's findings are that 79% of Americans identify as a person of faith, but only 51% of those who identify as people of faith are likely to vote in November, according to this new study. So, if we're just rounding them off to the larger numbers, 80% or so of Americans are people of faith, only 50% of those tend to vote. So that would mean that only 40% of the religious, or of the entire nation, of the entire electorate, are voting when it comes to those of religion. But the other 20% of people who are not religious, the majority of them tend to vote. So it almost kind of makes it that if you're not a religious person, your vote almost counts a little more. Not really, but in statistics it might seem that way. The study notes that about 4 out of every 5 Americans are people of faith. This includes those who self-identify as a person of faith or are associated with religion, recognized religious faiths such as Christianity, Judaism, Mormonism, Islam, etc. And out of this group, 51% are likely to vote, while 49% are not likely to vote. There are about 212 million adults who fit the person of faith category. If 49% of them do not turn out to vote, that would represent about 104 million non-voters. So basically, if you're trying to court the specifically religious people, at best, if you won over the entirety of the religious vote, you're only going to get about half of them voting for you, because the other half are not going to vote at all. So it almost might seem like, statistically speaking, a better bet to try to court the non-religious. So it just seems that, according to this study anyway, people of faith vote less likely than people of non-faith. So that might have an impact on why there's a lesser focus on religion than there maybe ever has been in a presidential election before. So let's move away from the election and let's go back to our old buddy from Oklahoma, Ryan Walters, Superintendent of Public Instruction Ryan Walters, still making news, still making headlines. At this point, I think he's just a shill for headlines. He's just trying to keep as much attention focused on him as possible. If I had to guess, it's because I think he's angling for a higher position in Trump's administration should Trump win the presidency. And, excuse me, if he manages to keep himself in the headlines all the way up through and past Election Day and Trump ends up winning, he sees this as a way that he could help his career and move up higher in the Trump administration. Of course, if Harris wins, then his career is pretty well over, and I think he knows it. But, of course, the ongoing battle with Ryan Walters is the mandate of having Bibles in all of the classrooms in Oklahoma. And now, the newest development is that Oklahoma parents and teachers are suing to stop top education officials' classroom Bible mandate. So, a group of Oklahoma parents of public school students, teachers, and ministers filed a lawsuit Thursday of this week seeking to stop the state's top education official from forcing schools to incorporate the Bible into lesson plans for students in grades 5 through 12. The lawsuit filed with the Oklahoma Supreme Court also asked the court to stop Republican State Superintendent Ryan Walters from spending $3 million to purchase Bibles in support of his mandate. So the plan is that Ryan Walters has $3 million that he has the ability to dole out in terms of education spending, and he wants to spend it to purchase Bibles. Now, obviously, this is a problem from a standpoint of separation of church and state. You shouldn't have to have Bibles in every classroom. What the hell is the purpose of having Bibles in a math class? What the hell is the purpose of having Bibles in a science class? Even if you wanted to use it in a philosophy class or a history class, that's all well and good for, I suppose. But it also becomes a problem when you get to the exact type of Bibles that Ryan Walters wanted to purchase. So they couldn't just say, hey, here's $3 million, go out and buy as many Bibles from, Barnes & Noble or whatever as you can get. No, the suit also notes that there was an initial request for proposal released by the State Department of Education to purchase the Bibles. And they had certain, because there's different types of Bibles. There's different there's the King James Version, there's the ESV, there's all different types of Bibles there are out there. So they had a proposal for what specific Bibles they wanted to get, and they came up with a list of things that they insisted that the Bible had to have, that they were going to put in all the classrooms. And the ones that they chose, the things that they put in this list of requirements for the Bible, appears to have been carefully tailored to match the Bibles endorsed by former President Donald Trump that he sells for $59.99 each. So, if you were unfamiliar with that story, Donald Trump sells a lot of stuff. He sells a lot of crap. He sells silver coins with his face on them. He sells trading cards. He's recently started selling watches, and he sells the Donald Trump Bible. And these things that he continually sells, the argument against them is that this is just a way to skirt campaign finance laws, because there's only so much money that you're allowed to send to politicians, to donate to politicians' campaigns. But there's no law saying you can't buy $3 million worth of the Bibles that he's hawking that probably cost less than $5 to stitch together, and his campaign keeps the rest of the money. So when it comes to all of this stuff that Donald Trump is selling, the argument against it all is that it all seems to be ways that you can just funnel more and more and more and more money into Trump's pocket and into his campaign efforts. And so this would just seem to be a way for Ryan Walters to essentially give a $3 million campaign donation to Donald Trump without it being considered a campaign donation. So that's another little wrinkle in the thing, in the story. It's like, oh, you're wanting to spend these $3 million of public funds, mind you, money from the taxpayers, to buy a crap ton of Donald Trump Bibles and end up giving Donald Trump just a crap ton more money. So that's a lawsuit that's still ongoing. Obviously, they just filed the suit. It hasn't been decided yet, but we'll find out what is going to happen with that story as it progresses. One more story I have for you over on Pope Watch. So the Pope was at a meeting of around a dozen LGBTQ activists and was urged to reverse the church's ban on gender-affirming care for transgender individuals. So, story talks about how Pope Francis faced calls to overturn the Catholic Church's ban on gender-affirming care for transgender people on Saturday when he held talks with LGBTQ activists at the Vatican. The 80-minute meeting, held privately at the guest house where the Pope lives, included a Catholic sister who works with LGBTQ people, a member of the transgender community, and a U.S. medical doctor who helps run a clinic providing gender-affirming hormonal care for adults. So obviously the Catholic Church has had a long-standing problem with people of the LGBTQ community, none more so than transgender people, and the hardline, fairly typical Christian position that transgender people, however you want to put it, don't exist or aren't valid, are mentally confused, and maybe they need corrective therapy to get them thinking that they actually are the gender they were born as, even though you're not born with a gender. The typical not understanding the difference between sex and gender thing. So all of that was addressed at this meeting that, hey, at least the Pope attended. And for all the problems with the Catholic Church in general and with the Pope, he has been more progressive, one could say, than probably any Pope in the past, and has made more outreach to LGBTQ community, as well as non-believers, as well in a host of different ways. And the people who were putting on the event and who were doing these proposals and trying to get this message to the Pope said, well, of one of them, I really wanted to share with Pope Francis about the joy that I have being a transgender Catholic person, Michael Sinnott, who took part in the meeting, told Reuters. Sinnott is a transgender man from Boston, said he told the pontiff about the joy that I get from hormone replacement therapy and the surgeries that I have had that make me feel comfortable in my body. And the people putting on this event said the Pope was very receptive. He listened very empathetically. He also shared that he always wants to focus on the person and the well-being of the person. Now, in terms of what the Pope has said in response, well, that's been nothing. The Vatican press office did not immediately respond to a request for comment about Saturday's meeting. So he hasn't officially said anything or given any official word on his stance after this meeting. Of course, it is a very recent meeting. It just took place. This was last Saturday. And there's low hope that I have that he will say anything positive about it. I imagine if he ends up saying anything about it at all, will come out saying and upholding the traditional Catholic view on transgenderism, that it's not something that he's willing to abide, and that he's not willing to affirm gender-affirming care for transgender individuals. That's what if I had to predict what I think is going to happen. If he says anything at all and doesn't just, ignore this until it kind of goes away and people stop asking him, hey, what'd you think of that LGBTQ meeting you were at? And he can move on to other things. I have very little hope that he'll end up coming out in favor of trans rights, but hey, he surprised me in the past, so I won't insist that that's going to be his standpoint. So there's hope, at least, that there may be some positive movement in terms of trans rights in the Catholic Church, but I'm not holding my breath on that one. All right, so that's all I have for news in terms of religious news in the last few weeks. So we're going to move on then to talk about some questions that have come from previous live streams. Every time one of these live streams end, if you have any questions you would like me to talk about and address in detail, you can put them into the comments section once this live stream ends and it goes up on the channel. Go down to the comments section, post your questions there, and I'll pull some for the next live stream held in a couple weeks' time. And I've done that. There's some questions that people asked in the previous live stream, and we're going to go through those now. So, question 1. The first question we got came from Sorcerons. Sorcerons asks, here's another question for your next stream. My family is predominantly Jewish, with only distant relatives believing in anything else, aside from me and my sister. My issue comes along when I try to discuss the topics and discussions I repeatedly hear my parents making useless excuses to protect themselves from the idea that a God they invested so much time in could be not real. I hate watching them jump through hoops and playing with mental gymnastics to try to justify their beliefs. Have you seen this with anyone you are or were close to? How did you work around it, or did you just give up after a certain amount of time? They are rather accepting of my atheism, but still whine and complain when I provide counters to their irrational arguments. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I come from a religious family, and practically everyone I know is religious or at least affirms some religion. A lot of the people, most of the people I know don't talk about it a ton, but if it's brought up, they will affirm that they believe in God or they go to church every Sunday. And when you say that your parents make excuses to protect themselves from the idea that a God they invested so much time in could be not real, yeah, that's absolutely true. It's called the sunk cost fallacy. It's where, and it doesn't just pertain to religion, but any kind of ideology or notion that a person has devoted a lot of time and energy into, and especially when it makes up part of their worldview, it makes up part of their sense of morality, it's really, really difficult to divorce themselves from it or even consider the possibility that it might not be real because of all of the effort and mental energy that they've expended putting into it, to then have to consider that it's not real. I mean, this is why people stick to their biases so strongly. This is why people in politics, when their political party that they've been a part of their entire life has radically changed from what it used to be, they'll still remain loyal to that party regardless of how much they disagree with them, to the point where it gets to the point where people are still voting for politicians that they disagree with in 100% of the cases, in 100% of issues, because they have the right party, the party that they're still loyal to because of the sunk cost fallacy. And it's certainly true when it comes to religion. Now, how to deal with it is very specific to the individual. It's going to be down to the context of how attached to the religion the person is, how committed you are to maintaining the relationship, how committed you are to espousing your own non-belief. If you're talking about like an acquaintance who is always talking about religion every time they open their mouth and is always trying to get you to go to church with them and is very annoying about it and won't shut up about it, and you can afford to not have much of a relationship with them, then sure, cut ties. But if you're talking about something like parents, well, the same can be true with parents. There are people who go no contact with parents for a variety of reasons. But that again goes to how strongly you want to maintain the relationship. If it's something like you're a minor and you still live with them, or you're not financially independent, then the advice would be to, keep your non-belief to yourself. And if they are rabidly pro-religion, just kind of try to deal with it until you can get out on your own. But if it's somebody who you can kind of not go into religion with. They're not always talking about religion. Like my parents don't talk about religion a ton. They go to church every Sunday, but when we get together and we hang out, they know I'm not religious, and we don't really talk about religion. We talk about tons of other stuff, you know. We talk about what's going on with family and friends, what's going on in the local community. We talk about politics, we talk about culture, we talk about tons of stuff. We just don't really talk about religion. And if you can get that with your family members who are religious, if you can get to that point, so much the better. But I would say don't try to be essentially the opposite side of the annoying evangelical. You know, don't be the annoying atheist who is always trying to tell your faithful family members that their God doesn't exist and is always belittling their religion. I am an atheist, obviously. I'm an atheist activist and counter-apologist. I do not talk shit about religion around my parents because they still believe in it. And I'm not trying to be a negative force in their life. So pick your battles, pick the relationships that you want to maintain and that you don't, and decide how much religious proselytizing you're willing to put up with. But it largely just comes down to the context and what's different for each individual person. So that's my advice there. Question the second. Shorter one. This one came from P2VA73XC6J3, who asked, "What the hell is scientism?" And was quickly answered by Evan K., who says, "A made-up word." And this is in response to our last live stream where we were taking a science versus religion quiz, and one of the comments, one of the questions had something in it about scientism. Scientism, yes, is indeed a made-up word, but, you know, technically all words are made up. But scientism is a phrase that you'll sometimes hear from religious people whose religion stands in stark contrast to what has been scientifically proven. So things like young earth creationists, they'll say this term scientism all the time because science has shown that the earth is very much older than 6,000 years old. Or religious people who are opposed to evolution, being how the diversification of life on this planet happened. They'll appeal to what they call scientism, or the secularists being proponents of scientism, essentially trying to turn science into a religion in and of itself. When they say that you're just adhering to scientism, what they're trying to say is you have no reason to think that, say, the earth is billions of years old. You're just going based on what the science priests have told you because you have a religious adherence to scientism. Trying to put scientific principles and what has been proven and established by science on the same level as religious dogma. And it doesn't work, obviously. There is tons and tons of evidence and proof to showcase the age of the earth, to showcase evolution and natural selection being responsible for the diversity of life, including human life. And so trying to reduce the entirety of science to a religion that people adhere to based on just belief and faith rather than actual proof and evidence really just showcases the ignorance of the people who use this word. Anybody who ever uses the word scientism, you know you're talking to somebody who is very uneducated on science. They don't know about the evidence, they don't know about the proof that scientific principles has, and they don't want to know. I mean, it's not just like they have never been exposed to it. They've never encountered the evidence. They've gone to school, you know, they got diplomas somehow, but they don't want to hear it. They don't want to know it. They don't want to understand it. And so they'll largely misrepresent science, straw man it in its entirety to try to make it sound stupid so that they can cling to their religion that stands in contrast to what science has proven. I don't have a lot of respect for the religious people who throw around terms like scientism. It's entirely possible to understand what science has proven and incorporate it into your religion and be a person of faith and be a believer and still understand that the earth is billions of years old and still understand that the universe is 13.7 billion years old and still understand that evolution is a real thing, and tons of other things. So yeah, if you see somebody using the term scientism, consider that 2 strikes against them right off the bat. And this leads into the next question from Logical Psychopath. So talking more about science versus faith, Logical Psychopath says, 1, science does not require faith. It requires total opposite of faith, and that's skepticism. No matter which definition of faith you use, it is opposed to science. 2, no, you cannot be a good scientist and sincerely religious. To be religious, you must have faith, blind belief, in things with no evidence or despite evidence, and you must not doubt the religious claims. To be a scientist, you must use a scientific method, and you must never have faith. You must follow evidence. You must have doubt, skepticism, the literal foundation of science. So no, you cannot be a good scientist and sincerely religious. Science and religion are portal opposites in their roots. I disagree with Logical Psychopath here. A lot of what he says is fine, but I do think it's totally possible to be both religious and a good scientist so long as they don't really interact. So long as your religion does not entreat on your science and your science doesn't butt its nose into your religion. So for instance, if somebody is works in pharmacology, if somebody is trying to create a cancer drug that will help to lessen tumors and eradicate cancerous cells, they can easily be a believer in God and they can go to church every Sunday. Their science that they do, their religion doesn't entreat on it. It has no bearing on the work that they do in trying to find a cure for cancer. And the same can be true of many different scientific fields. It's totally possible to believe in a higher power and to accept that higher power on faith, to be a member of many different kinds of religion. There might be some religious faiths and organizations that might make it very difficult to be certain kinds of scientists. Obviously, it'd be really hard to be a young Earth creationist and be an evolutionary biologist. That would be really hard, obviously, to maintain both of those when they are in such defiance of each other. But yeah, you can be somebody who does any number of different scientific fields. You can be an engineer and believe in God. You can be a Buddhist and be a biologist. You can do all manner of science and still believe in something supernatural, just so long as you stick to the scientific method. As Logical Psychopath says, in science, you must use the scientific method. So yes, if you're a scientist and you're abandoning the scientific method in favor of religious dogma and faith, you're being a bad scientist. Like, say, everybody at the Discovery Institute. Like, say, James Tour. Like, say, all the people that Professor Dave, who's amazing, argues against. Yeah, they're bad scientists. And there are plenty of bad scientists out there who don't do real science. They have real science degrees, but they don't do real science and instead overwrite their faith onto what should be science. They're doing it wrong. But it's totally possible to be a good scientist and do good science and use the scientific method and still believe in a higher power. You just kind of really need to keep them separated. One more question, a longer one this time, but this one came from LDM Tag. Question: atheists usually dismiss anecdotal evidence for God, claims of witnessing miracles and things like that. But how should we deal with such evidence coming from a person you trust? For example, a notable historical YouTuber, Metatron, claims to have experienced actual miracles, not just some silly feeling like God have answered them, or your own sister argues that magic indeed works, which she claims to know from experience. The last one, I can test it, though I'm scared, since changing your whole worldview is a rather unpleasant activity. But how can I test or disprove those YouTubers' claims? Rhetorical question, I know, I can't. But I also cannot just ignore them, because any hypothesis/theory about how this world works should explain all the data, not just some of it. Should we even attempt to scientifically explain miracles/visions/supposedly working magic, if it indeed does pass some test, or dismiss because we have no big statistics of such events? And let's say if you made a ritual for earning exactly $18,000 and you get that exact into your bonus, dismiss it as a funny coincidence? I know neither means God exists, let alone any specific God. It just bothers me that I can't explain either from a naturalistic standpoint. All right, so there's a lot in here. Try to parse through it. What should you do when claims of the supernatural or God or something like that come from a person you trust? Well, that's probably going to happen because it's tough to not know and have respect for at least somebody who has religious faith. Just because you respect somebody doesn't mean that you have to accept everything that they have to say or every position that they take. Frankly, if there is anybody you agree with on 100% of all cases, you should question whether or not you actually agree with them or if you're just agreeing with them in everything because you like them and because you respect them. Are you really forming your own positions on things, or are you just adopting someone else's? I can't think of anybody I agree with on 100% of all things in all cases. And just because you don't agree with somebody who you trust and respect, it doesn't mean like they're lying to you. So like if there's this YouTuber who you like and respect and agree with and they're saying something that you disagree with, it doesn't mean they're lying. It just means they have a understanding of that topic or that event that you disagree with. Their perspective doesn't line up with yours. And it's totally fine to have disagreements with just about anybody. Just know why you think the way you do on things, on why you have the standpoints that you have. And then when they go on to say, your own sister argues that magic indeed works, which she claims to know from experience. Well, you can trust that that's her interpretation, that she's being honest with you, that she really thinks she really knows about magic and that she really has evidence that magic works. And you can think, I disagree with her. I think she's misunderstanding the situation. What she saw as magic could just be purely natural coincidence, or she could be misremembering it, or some other reason that she's not right. She's not lying, she's not being deceptive, but I don't think her conclusion is correct. Just because you love somebody and just because you generally agree with them doesn't mean you have to agree with them on absolutely everything. And then when you say that I also can't just ignore them because any hypothesis or theory about how this world works should explain all the data. That's not necessarily true either. As humans, we are just trying our best to explain the things around us, and we don't always get everything right. Not every hypothesis or theory about how the world works explains everything. I mean, the theory of relativity worked pretty well and explained all the data that we had when it was developed, but then when we discovered quantum mechanics, relativity didn't really work. So we had to revise it. We came up with special relativity, and we came up with different understanding of quantum mechanics. Didn't mean we threw out what we knew before. Didn't mean we threw out the theory of relativity. It just meant that we had to revise how it worked, that it doesn't work at the quantum scale. It works for us in most cases, but it doesn't completely explain the entirety of the world, and it doesn't explain all the data. So you work with what you've got, you do the best with what you got, and if you can explain most things, but you can't necessarily explain everything, that doesn't mean that your hypothesis or your theory is completely wrong and needs to be thrown out entirely. It might mean you haven't found all the data yet. It might mean that there's still variables that will make your theory work, make your hypothesis work, and other times it won't. So, yeah, you don't have to be able to explain everything, and if it doesn't explain everything, throw it out in its entirety. There may be bits and pieces of it that do actually work, and it just needs some revision over time. But yeah, you don't have to fully trust anyone just because you generally agree with them when they say something or take a supernatural position or belief in magic or belief in religion that you don't agree with. So, those are the questions from the audience. And like I said at the top of this, if you have any questions you would like me to tackle in more detail when this live stream ends, goes up on my channel, go down into the comments section, put your own question in there. I'll pull out some and I'll answer it in the next live stream. Which just about brings us to the end of our material for the day. So we'll start to wrap things up. Before I do so, I want to give a extra special shout out to somebody who was extremely generous on my previous video that just went out yesterday. So big shout out to Autumnal Fling, who gave a massively generous donation. Big props, big thank you to Autumnal Fling. Thank you so much. You're a rock star. As well as a big thank you, of course, to all my Patreon supporters. So if you want to support my work directly, I have a Patreon that's there on my screen, and you can check it out down in the description of this video as well. Also, I have my Twitter link down there if you'd like to keep up with what I do throughout the course of the week. Usually, I post stuff through on Twitter every weekday, so I'm pretty active on there. I will never call it X. It is always Twitter. And I have a Teespring, so if you want some Plinky merchandise, if you want any t-shirts, sweatshirts, or coffee mugs, or stickers, or anything with a cute little pink cycloptic tribble face on it, you can check out my Teespring as well. So, thanks for hanging out with me, everybody. Thanks for spending your Heathen Sunday with me, and we'll do it all again in another couple of weeks. But that's all I have for you today. Have a happy Halloween, because I won't have another live stream prior to Halloween. And if you're in the U.S. and you're of voting age, make sure you get registered if you haven't already. Early vote if you haven't already and can do so. And definitely get out to the polls, whoever it is you decide to vote for. But until next time, I'm Professor Plink, reminding you to keep striving for greater understanding. It's the best way to get wherever you want to go.